Next, Folding Ideas goes over a real-world example of how blockchain could be implemented, and as we'll see more than once in this video, he does a decent job of laying out broad concepts, but then fails to look for any solutions in the details.
One of the big selling points of all this technology is that it's particularly secure. Very difficult for anyone to hack it directly since there's so much redundancy. A lot of hay is made about the system's resiliency against man-in-the-middle attacks, which are your classic Hollywood hacker-type attacks.
Now, this is both true and irrelevant for exactly the reasons Dan is about to point out to us. Dan is going to tell us about how most fraud is not the man-in-the-middle type, and rather a matter of people inputting information that was actually wrong in the first place, thus making blockchains pretty unhelpful in the world of fraud. He also goes on to say that given the decentralized nature of the blockchain, the need for this type of security was actually introduced by the blockchain itself, a problem it introduced and then purported to solve. Now, there's two main points I'd like to make about this. First, it's not really the Hollywood hacker types that people are afraid of here. It's the governments and institutions that can kind of change the rules whenever they see fit. Recall my example from earlier of the everyday practice of banks rearranging transaction history to try and maximize overdraft fees. Something that Folding Ideas readily admits is essentially a poverty tax. This is only one of the many issues with the traditional banking system, the Fed's outsized power being a much bigger relevant example to today's economic situation. It's seen as worthwhile to take power away from these entities and eliminate the capriciousness of that system. And the hurdle that needs to be overcome in that case is, as Dan points out, the vulnerability to man-in-the-middle attacks. So the point that blockchain introduced these problems and then purported to solve them, yeah, that's the motivation. That was literally the point. Of course, if you want to cut these people out, you're gonna have to solve the man-in-the-middle problem, because these are the normal men in the middle. You want to cut them out, so you need to be able to basically perform their function in a way that's safe for people to use. That's the point. Second, you'll note that nowhere in that first point did I say anything about having to solve input fraud. As Dan points out, input fraud already exists in the world of physical records and digital Web 2 records. To say that blockchain doesn't solve these problems and is therefore an inefficient, useless, and redundant system is like saying evolution is nonsense because it doesn't solve abiogenesis, which is a common argument used by religious people to deny evolution. Of course, the answer to this is that evolution doesn't propose to solve abiogenesis. That's a whole nother question. Evolution describes how life, which is presupposed to exist in its framework, evolves through mutations and selection pressures. Evolution, as we understand it now, is inherently not about abiogenesis. Similarly, ways to handle things like input fraud have existed completely independent of blockchains for some time now. Now, I'd rather not turn this into like a half-hour rundown of how exactly fraud is prevented at the various different stages, but we'll go over some of the basic concepts, terminology, and methods here. In general, there's three sides to the so-called triangle of fraud, right? So there's opportunity, pressures, and rationalization. When constructing a profile of fraudsters, motive is also taken into account. So some are predatory and very intentional. Some are opportunistic or even accidental. Note that a similar issue to what's presented with regard to blockchains was also seen with computers and the internet. Indeed, what's good about computers also makes them more vulnerable. Databases are large and access privileges can be difficult to create and enforce, making theft, destruction, or alteration of data easier and quicker. The desire to allow employees, customers, and vendors access to their organization's system also creates greater exposure. Once a computer system is altered or accessed, it remains that way until the system is no longer used or the breach is discovered. Once a computer system is altered or accessed, it essentially remains that way until the breach is discovered or the system is no longer in use. So these trade-offs already exist in the web as it exists today, but they're deemed worthwhile given the benefits that come with them. We'll come back to this shortly, so just tuck that away in your noggin. The existing solutions to the problem of fraud, including cyber fraud, include pre-employment screening, policies on non-use or confidentiality of information, personnel review policies, error correction control built into the system, separation of duties, separation of functions, signatures and counter-signatures, and job rotations policies. Notice that nowhere in that list does blockchain or anything that even resembles it enter into the picture. Something that requires a physical action by a physical person, like, for instance, input fraud, is dealt with in a real world by policies and safeguards that watch over people physically. This is not where blockchain comes into play. So where does it come into play? Glad you asked, because that leads us into Dan's next point as we start talking about whether or not blockchains can revolutionize the shipping industry.
First, the things that blockchain is capable of tracking are things that manufacturers and shippers are already tracking, or at least trying to track. So this is not so much revolution as it would be standardization.
Whoa. Hold on there just a second. So immediately we run into folding ideas. Kind of presenting the general concept with a token qualifier before confidently making a statement that's a lot more arguable than he makes it seem. As always, the devil is in the details here, so let's talk about the details. How is it exactly that blockchain technology could change the shipping industry? First, let's motivate this discussion by talking about what problems the shipping industry might have to solve in the first place. Shipping delays, often caused by slow, manual administrative processes, have massive financial ramifications. The average time it takes for funds to reach invoicing companies is about 42 days, leading to hundreds of billions of dollars sitting stagnant each day. Processing and administration costs can comprise nearly a fifth of total transportation costs because of the labor-intensive and error-prone nature of the industry's manual document handling. Furthermore, high volumes of canceled orders, unpredictable cargo movements, and cargo loss are costly problems made worse by the lack of real-time information available to the companies in question. The ability to track and correct an issue in a timely manner depends on reliable access to data, something traditional business practices prevent when shipments are tracked in the margins of hard copy paperwork. There's also issues regarding bills of lading, forms that detail the amounts, types, and destinations of the things carried in a shipment. A bill of lading provides all the information necessary to process a document for both the carrier and shipper, while also serving as a receipt, contract, and document of ownership of the goods. These are typically physical documents that are mailed to ports and arrive after the goods themselves. Note that input fraud is by no means the only concern when it comes to physical bills of lading. They can and are modified with inaccurate cargo descriptions, forged signatures, and false corporate logos. In other words, these are kind of the analog version of a man-in-the-middle attack when done after the initial bill is made. We should also note that shipping transactions these days are extremely inefficient and expensive. Digitizing paperwork alone costs an estimated $38 million a year and comes with its own carbon footprint. There's also a distinct lack of automation, with all transactions consequently requiring individual invoicing and bank transfer completion before they can go through, which introduces risk of loss due to, non-payment or, fluctuation in exchange rates. The U.S. Department of Transportation Maritime Administration compiled a report regarding the utility of blockchain technology in the shipping industry and have come up with 3 key areas which blockchain technology can improve the shipping industry: shipment tracking, smart bills of lading, and smart contracts. You can read the details for yourself in the description below. As for the impact of this, it kind of depends on how you define revolutionary, which is a largely semantic point I have no interest in litigating because, frankly, the benefits here speak for themselves. And we're not even done listing them, but do you see what I'm talking about here? Dan's little throwaway qualifier of, or at least trying to track, is literally where like 99% of the relevant information is hiding. But, his big picture conceptual talking points kind of focusing on things like input fraud, the abiogenesis to the issue at hand's evolution, keep him from kind of seeing the picture here.
Even that is built on a predicate assumption that everyone picks the same chain. It's an extremely optimistic assumption. Many firms deliberately want their information centralized and obfuscated to protect against corporate espionage. The lack of a shared, standardized bucket to put all the information into is not because it's been heretofore impossible, but because it's been undesirable.
So there's a couple of things we gotta unpack here. First, let's talk about that single chain idea, that everyone would have to agree to the same blockchain, right? This is blatantly false. If you're a crypto native in the modern era and you're not an Ethereum or Bitcoin maximalist, you know that the future is multi-chain. Chains like Polkadot and Cosmos are inherently built around this idea. We really don't even need to go any further on this, and I'm frankly a little taken aback that he even makes this point. But screw it, let's go a little further into it. Aside from the simple fact that multi-chain solutions are growing more available every single day, what else might motivate shipping companies and the companies they service to play nice in the blockchain space? Well, for one, the various inefficiencies that we listed above. On top of those, there are many more opportunities for, enhanced efficiency, cost reduction, and sustainability improvements. Shipping accounts for something like 3% of global carbon dioxide emissions. For one, the low-quality sulfurous bunker fuels used in cargo ships is pretty hard to track and trace because of note-based acquisition systems. As a result, it's pretty easy to mislead shippers on the origins and quality of said product. Projects like Bunker Trace are working to bring standardization to the industry with blockchain technology in order to make more consistent compliance with regulation easier. Furthermore, around $25 billion and 280 million tons of CO2 are lost to shipping containers crossing the ocean empty, which is a stupid way to generate 280 million tons of CO2. Filling this space by accurately tracking said vacancies in real time and then selling those vacancies in order to efficiently use that space is something that CubeX Global is tackling with blockchain technology right now. The paper bills of lading that we mentioned before are estimated to cost something like 400,000 trees per year. In conjunction with the trends and advancements in the space that we discussed earlier, these savings in carbon emissions add up pretty quickly when you consider that these same types of things can be seen in multiple industries. $25 billion, 280 million tons of CO2, and 400,000 trees a year. This is just a part of the shipping industry that we're going to be benefiting with blockchain technology. We should also at this point mention how this affects the effectiveness of government sustainability regulations. By storing information like fuel quality and standardized estimates of carbon emissions on blockchains, it makes it easier to monitor and report emissions, issue carbon credits, and otherwise streamline the process of complying with regulation. Many of the issues we've listed, if addressed, could be a huge boon with regard to the bottlenecking issues we've seen recently as a result of the pandemic and further offset the environmental impact of proof-of-work mining. Next, we come to his point about corporate espionage. Now, corporate espionage is a thing, and many companies do spend a lot of money trying to circumvent it. However, obfuscating shipping logs is not exactly a great way to do that. Yes, it might make, collecting and selling customer lists for espionage purposes more difficult, but as we noted, there's a pretty significant cost to doing so, not only to the shipping companies themselves, but to the companies they service. This particular type of corporate espionage is to corporate espionage what man-in-the-middle attacks are to traditional fraud. Not the biggest fish to fry. I mean, yeah, it's a common form of fraud. Don't get me wrong. It's a low-hanging fruit type of fraud. People sell that type of information all the time, but the hard-hitting type of corporate espionage typically has to do with trade secrets, not customer lists. On top of that, crypto provides many potential ways around certain forms of corporate espionage. Shipping containers are going to shipping ports and then distribution centers, but the actual transactions themselves could be significantly better hidden by simply using a very specific type of blockchain to make the transactions. Indeed, the crypto wallet that's being used by the customer doesn't have to actually have a person's identity attached to it. And depending on which blockchain is used, there would be a varying amount of difficulty figuring out who that person might be. If they happen to be using Monero, if they're really careful, there's a chance that you will never figure out who they are, if they're careful. If it's post-Taproot Bitcoin, there's going to be significantly less difficulty, but it's also not necessarily going to be super trivial, once again, if they're careful. Obfuscation, if that's what they're worried about, would more easily be done by simply using a more privacy-centered blockchain in order to effect those transactions. More importantly than anything I just said, do you really think that shipping companies are keeping themselves in the dark ages in order to protect the companies they're servicing from corporate espionage, this strikes me as quite the stretch in the face of the factors already listed, but also given one last really important factor. The switch to blockchain is already happening en masse. Around half of maritime shipments already use blockchain technology in some form, and IBM's TradeLens is gaining serious traction. Not to mention some of the biggest cargo companies themselves forming the global shipping business network to provide greater blockchain access to other cargo companies. In short, the points about lack of benefits and corporate espionage don't stand up in the face of real-world use cases and rapid adoption.